The evening rush had just begun at Rosie's Diner, a cozy establishment nestled between a bookstore and a record shop in the heart of Pine Creek. The small town wasn't known for much, except perhaps its annual summer music festival, that somehow managed to attract impressive talent from across the country. Tonight, the diner buzzed with energy as locals and visitors alike sought comfort food and conversation. Elena wiped her forehead with the back of her hand as she balanced 3 plates along her arm. At 27, she'd mastered the art of waitressing through years of practice. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and despite the chaos of the dinner rush, her warm brown eyes remained alert and kind. She'd been on her feet since noon, but she moved between tables with practiced efficiency. "Order up for table 7, called Mick from the kitchen window, his voice barely audible above the clinking of silverware and the murmur of conversation. "Got it," Elena replied, finishing with her current table before heading to pick up the next order. The bell above the door chimed, announcing a new customer. Elena glanced over to see a man in his mid-30s with an air of importance about him. He wore a tailored blazer that stood out among the casual attire of the other diners, and his expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. He stood at the entrance, scanning the room with slight disapproval before the hostess led him to a small corner table. Elena noticed the hostess point in her direction, assigning her section to the newcomer. She nodded and made a mental note to get to him after delivering the hot plates she was carrying. 3 minutes later, Elena approached his table with a genuine smile. "Welcome to Rosie's. Can I start you off with something to drink?" The man looked up from his phone with slight irritation, as if her arrival had interrupted something important. "Just water, no ice, with lemon on the side. Not in the glass," he said without making eye contact, his attention already returning to his screen. "Coming right up," Elena responded pleasantly, unfazed by his curtness. She'd served enough customers to know that some people carried their bad days with them wherever they went. When she returned with his water, he was speaking to someone on the phone, discussing what sounded like musical arrangements and schedule changes. Elena set the water down carefully, placing the lemon wedge on a small side plate as requested. "Are you ready to order, or do you need a few minutes?" she asked when he ended his call. "I'll have the grilled salmon with the sauce on the side," he said, barely glancing at the menu, "and make sure it's not overcooked." Elena jotted down his order, complete with his specifications. "Absolutely. Our chef does a wonderful job with the salmon. It comes with seasonal vegetables and your choice of potato or rice." "Fine, whatever comes with it," he replied dismissively. "And I'm in a hurry." As Elena turned to place his order, her foot caught on an uneven floorboard, a notorious spot that the owner had promised to fix for months. She stumbled slightly and the water glass on her tray tipped over, spilling across the edge of the table and onto the man's sleeve before she could catch it. "I am so sorry," Elena exclaimed, quickly grabbing napkins from her apron pocket. "Let me help. Are you kidding me?" The man cut her off, jumping up from his seat. His voice carried across the diner, causing several heads to turn. "This is Italian wool. Do you have any idea how much this cost?" Elena's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but she maintained her composure. "I truly apologize, sir. I'll get more napkins right away and we'll take care of your dry cleaning bill. I doubt this place could afford my dry cleaning." He scoffed loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. Then, with a dismissive laugh that seemed designed to humiliate, he added, "Maybe stick to carrying plates you can handle. This is why some people never move beyond waiting tables." The diner had grown uncomfortably quiet. Elena felt the stares of other customers, some sympathetic, others simply curious about the unfolding drama. Among the onlookers was Hank, a regular who worked at the festival venue, his expression darkening at the man's rudeness. "I'll get you a fresh water and some club soda for the stain," Elena said evenly, refusing to let his comments pierce her professional demeanor. 10 years of customer service had thickened her skin considerably. "Don't bother with the club soda," he replied coldly. "Just get my order in and bring me another water. Try not to spill it this time." As Elena walked back to the kitchen, she held her head high despite feeling the weight of the man's judgment. She'd grown accustomed to difficult customers, but something about his particular brand of condescension stung more than usual. "What's with Mr. Sunshine in the corner?" asked Darlene, an older waitress who had worked at Rosie's for over 2 decades. "Just having a bad day, I guess," Elena replied, filling a fresh glass of water. Darlene peeked around the corner at the man, who was now dabbing at his sleeve with obvious annoyance. Wait a minute, she whispered. Isn't that the pianist? The one headlining the festival this weekend? Elena glanced back. She hadn't been paying attention to the festival lineup this year. Between waitressing, her graduate studies, and practice hours, she barely had time to sleep, let alone check the festival program. His name's Reed Thompson, Darlene continued. My daughter has tickets to his show. Apparently he's some big shot in the classical world. Well, Fister Big Shot could use some manners, muttered Mick from the grill, who had overheard the exchange with the customer. Elena shrugged and returned to the table with fresh water. Reed Thompson took it without acknowledgement, now deeply focused on something on his tablet. The next 15 minutes passed uneventfully as Elena attended to her other tables. When Reed's meal arrived, she delivered it promptly, making sure everything was exactly as he'd specified. Will there be anything else? She asked professionally. This is fine, he replied without looking up. Throughout his meal, Elena maintained her distance while ensuring his water glass remained full. She noticed he ate methodically, occasionally making notes on his tablet between bites. Despite his rude behavior, she couldn't help but observe that he had the focused intensity of someone completely dedicated to their craft. She recognized that quality. She saw it in herself when she practiced piano late into the night. Long after her fingers had grown stiff and tired, from across the diner, Hank caught Elena's eye and gave her an encouraging smile. He'd been coming to Rosie's for years and had always appreciated Elena's friendly service and quiet dignity. He'd also noticed something most patrons hadn't, the calluses on her fingertips, distinctive to those who spent hours at piano keys. As Reed Thompson finished his meal and waited for the check, Hank approached his table. Elena watched curiously as they exchanged words. Reed seemed surprised by whatever Hank was saying, his expression shifting from annoyance to something resembling interest as he glanced briefly in Elena's direction. When Elena brought the check, Reed's demeanor had changed subtly. He still didn't smile, but the sharp edge of his arrogance seemed slightly dulled. Was everything to your satisfaction? Elena asked, the question purely professional. Reed looked at her directly for the first time. The food was adequate, he said, then hesitated as if debating whether to say more. Whatever thought had crossed his mind, he apparently decided against it and simply handed her his credit card. When Elena returned with his receipt, Reed was gathering his things. He signed the slip without comment, left a precisely calculated 15% tip, not generous but not insultingly small either, and departed without another word. As the door closed behind him, Elena released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Don't let folks like that get to you. Honey, Darlene said, appearing beside her. Some people are so busy being important that they forget how to be decent. Elena smiled. I've dealt with worse. Besides, we never know what someone else is going through. You're too nice, Darlene replied with a shake of her head. Later, as the dinner rush wound down, Hank lingered at the counter, waiting until Elena had a moment to spare. That guy who was rude to you earlier, he said when she came to refill his coffee. He's the headliner for the festival this weekend. Supposedly brilliant, but clearly lacking in the human decency department. So I heard, Elena replied. It's fine, really. Hank studied her for a moment. You know, Lisa from the festival committee is in a bind. Their opening act for tomorrow canceled last minute. Some kind of travel problem. When I mentioned to Reed Thompson that you play, he seemed surprised. Elena froze. You told him I play piano? I might have mentioned that the waitress he just insulted has performed at Carnegie Hall, Hank said with a mischievous grin. I didn't tell him you're working on your doctorate in piano performance or that you're only waiting tables to make ends meet while you finish your studies. Figured I'd leave some mystery. Elena groaned. Hank, why would you do that? Because Lisa needs someone to fill that opening slot, and you need people to hear you play if you're ever going to get the recognition you deserve. He placed a business card on the counter. She wants you to call her tonight. The slot's yours if you want it. Elena stared at the card, her heart suddenly racing. A chance to perform at the festival, even as a last-minute replacement, could be the opportunity she'd been waiting for. But the thought of seeing Reed Thompson again, this time as a fellow performer rather than someone he could dismiss as just a waitress, filled her with a complicated mix of anxiety and determination. Think about it, Hank said, dropping a generous tip beside his empty coffee cup. Sometimes the universe has funny ways of putting us exactly where we need to be. As Elena pocketed the card and cleared Hank's cup, she couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow might bring. The piano had always been her escape, her true voice. Perhaps it was time to let that voice be heard by more than just her professors and the empty practice rooms where she spent her precious free hours. She glanced at the corner table where Reed Thompson had sat, remembering his dismissive laugh. The memory no longer stung, instead it fueled something like resolve. Whether she took the festival opportunity or not, she knew one thing for certain. There was far more to her story than anyone could see from a brief encounter in a busy diner. Elena stared at the ceiling of her small apartment, sleep evading her despite the late hour. The business card from the festival coordinator lay on her nightstand, and she had already called Lisa and agreed to perform. A mixture of excitement and anxiety churned in her stomach as she thought about tomorrow's performance. After tossing and turning for another 20 minutes, she gave up on sleep and swung her legs over the side of the bed. The wooden floor creaked beneath her feet as she padded across the room to the upright piano that dominated her living space. It wasn't a grand piano by any means, just a well-loved instrument she'd purchased secondhand from a retiring music teacher, but it had served her faithfully through countless hours of practice. Elena flipped through her sheet music in the dim light, eventually settling on Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment before she began to play, keeping the volume soft out of consideration for her neighbors. As the familiar melody filled the small room, her mind cleared, and for a little while she forgot about Reed Thompson and his cutting remarks. In these quiet moments with just herself and the music, nothing else mattered. Morning arrived too quickly. Elena woke with a start, momentarily confused to find herself slouched over the piano. She'd fallen asleep mid-practice, something that hadn't happened since her undergraduate days. With a groan, she straightened up, her neck stiff from the awkward position. Her alarm clock showed 7:15 a.m., barely enough time to get ready for her 9 a.m. practice slot at the festival venue. After a hurried shower and a quick breakfast consisting of toast and coffee, Elena gathered her sheet music and headed out. The Pine Creek Arts Center was a 20-minute walk from her apartment, a converted old theater that had been lovingly restored by the community. As she approached the building, she noticed increased activity around the premises, technicians testing sound equipment, vendors setting up food stalls for later, and early bird festival staff coordinating the day's events. At the performer's entrance, a young woman with a clipboard and a festival lanyard checked her name. Elena Rivera? Great, you're right on time, she said, marking something on her list. Lisa told me about the last-minute change. We're so glad you could fill in. She handed Elena a performer's badge. You're scheduled for a sound check at 9:30 after your practice slot. Your performance is at 1 p.m., opening for the afternoon sessions. Elena thanked her and made her way through the backstage area, navigating the maze of equipment cases and busy crew members. She was directed to a small practice room equipped with an upright piano. It wasn't ideal, but it would do for warming up. As she settled in, placing her music on the stand and adjusting the bench, Elena tried to calm the fluttering in her chest. It had been months since she'd performed for an audience larger than her professors and fellow students. The festival might not be Carnegie Hall, but it attracted serious music lovers and industry professionals. This was an unexpected opportunity, and she was determined to make the most of it. For the next hour, Elena lost herself in practice, running through her planned program and making mental notes about tempo and expression. She'd chosen a mix of classical pieces and 2 of her own compositions. A risk, perhaps, but she wanted to showcase not just her technical ability, but also her creative voice. Just as she was finishing a particularly challenging passage, a knock at the door interrupted her concentration. Your sound check is in 5 minutes, called a voice from outside. Elena gathered her things and headed to the main stage. The auditorium was largely empty except for a few technicians adjusting lights and sound equipment. The stage, however, was brilliantly lit, and at its center stood a magnificent grand piano, its polished surface gleaming under the lights. That's a Steinway D, said a technician, noticing Elena's appreciative gaze. Brought in specially for the festival. Our headliner insisted on it, but you'll get to break it in. Elena approached the instrument with reverence, running her fingers lightly over the keys. The action was perfect, responsive, but with just enough resistance to allow for control and expression. This was a far cry from her weathered upright at home, or even the decent but overused pianos in the university practice rooms. During the sound check, Elena played excerpts from each piece in her program, working with the sound engineer to ensure the perfect balance. She was so absorbed in the process that she didn't notice the figure standing in the shadows at the back of the auditorium. Reed Thompson had slipped in unnoticed, curious about the last-minute replacement he'd heard about from the festival director that morning. As Elena played a passage from her own composition, combining classical elements with subtle jazz influences, Reed leaned forward in his seat, his interest piqued. The waitress from the diner was certainly competent, he had to admit. Her technique was solid, though he noted a slight hesitation in a particularly demanding section. But there was something else in her playing, an emotional honesty that couldn't be taught, only felt. He left before she finished, not wanting to be discovered. Reed had arrived early for his own rehearsal time, scheduled after Elena's, and now found himself in the peculiar position of waiting for the waitress to finish so he could use the piano. The irony wasn't lost on him. Elena completed her sound check, feeling satisfied with the adjustments they'd made. As she gathered her sheet music, the stage manager approached her. "You sound wonderful," he said with an encouraging smile. "The next slot is for Reed Thompson, so we need to clear the stage. But feel free to use the practice room until your performance time." At the mention of Reed's name, Elena's stomach tightened. She hadn't considered that she might actually cross paths with him again so soon. Gathering her composure, she nodded and made her way backstage. As she turned down the corridor toward the practice rooms, Elena nearly collided with someone coming from the opposite direction. She looked up to apologize and found herself face to face with Reed Thompson himself. For a moment, neither spoke. Recognition flickered in his eyes, not just of the waitress who had spilled water on him, but now also of the musician who had just been using his piano. "Excuse me," Elena said finally, her voice calm despite her racing heart. Reed stepped aside slightly, but not enough to let her pass without comment. "You're the replacement opening act," he stated rather than asked. "Yes." "Elena Rivera," she replied, extending her hand professionally. Reed hesitated before shaking it briefly. "I wasn't aware that I didn't know you were a pianist." His tone suggested he was still processing this information. "There's a lot you don't know about me," Elena said simply, meeting his gaze without flinching. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them before Reed cleared his throat. "I heard part of your sound check. Your Bach was competent. The arpeggios in the third movement could use more fluidity, though." Elena bit back a defensive response. Instead, she smiled politely. "Thank you for the feedback. I won't keep you from your rehearsal." As she moved to walk past him, Reed spoke again, his voice losing some of its edge. "That piece toward the end, it wasn't familiar." "It's one of my own compositions," Elena replied. "You compose as well?" Something like genuine surprise crossed his features. "When I have time between serving water and studying for my doctorate in piano performance," she said, unable to resist the subtle jab. Reed had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "About yesterday, it's fine," Elena cut him off. "Water under the bridge, or rather water on an Italian wool jacket." She offered a small smile to soften her words. "Good luck with your rehearsal." Before he could respond, she continued down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. Standing up to him had been both terrifying and exhilarating. She hadn't planned to mention her doctorate, but the words had tumbled out in response to his condescension. Back in the practice room, Elena tried to focus, but her mind kept returning to the encounter. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Perhaps an apology or at least some acknowledgement of his behavior. Instead, he'd offered a backhanded compliment and criticism. Still, the fact that he'd noticed her original composition gave her a small sense of satisfaction. As the hours ticked by, Elena's nerves grew increasingly frayed. She'd performed in recitals before, even competitions, but never at a professional festival like this one. What if she messed up? What if her original pieces weren't well received? And why did it suddenly matter so much what Reed Thompson might think? At noon, Lisa, the festival coordinator, poked her head into the practice room. "How are you feeling? Ready to wow the crowd?" Elena managed a nervous smile. "As ready as I'll ever be." "The house is filling up nicely," Lisa said encouragingly. "We've got a good mix today. Local music lovers, some critics, even a few industry people. Just play like you did during the sound check and you'll be fantastic. After Lisa left, Elena closed her eyes and took several deep breaths, using the centering techniques her first piano teacher had taught her. She reminded herself why she played, not for acclaim or recognition, but because music was the truest way she knew to express herself, to communicate the things for which she had no words. At 12:45, a stagehand knocked on her door. 15 minutes, Ms. Rivera. Elena gathered her sheet music one last time, smoothed her simple black dress, and headed toward the stage. As she waited in the wings, she could hear the murmur of the audience, the occasional laugh or greeting as people found their seats. The festival director stepped on stage to introduce her, mentioning her last-minute addition to the program and her credentials as a doctoral candidate at the State University. And then it was time. Elena walked onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding her. She approached the magnificent piano at center stage, adjusted the bench to her height, and looked out at the audience. The auditorium wasn't full, but it was a respectable crowd for an early afternoon slot. As her eyes adjusted to the lights, Elena scanned the faces before her. In the third row, she spotted Darlene and Mick from the diner, who had rearranged their shifts to support her. Near the back sat Hank, giving her an encouraging thumbs up. And there, in the aisle seat halfway back, sat Reed Thompson, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Elena took a deep breath, placed her hands on the keys, and began to play. The first notes flowed from Elena's fingers like water, clear, precise, and effortless. She had chosen to begin with Bach's Prelude in C major, a piece whose apparent simplicity belied its emotional depth. As the familiar arpeggios filled the auditorium, the tension in her shoulders began to ease. This was where she belonged. For the first minute, Elena was acutely aware of the audience, of Reed Thompson's critical gaze, of the weight of expectation. But as she moved deeper into the piece, everything else faded away until there was only the music, the conversation between her fingers and the magnificent Steinway, between the composer's intentions and her own interpretation. She transitioned smoothly into the more technically challenging fugue, her left and right hands weaving independent melodic lines that somehow formed a perfect whole. A few audience members leaned forward in their seats, surprised by the technical prowess of this unknown musician. In the third row, Darlene nudged Mick and whispered something that made him nod in agreement. As the final notes of Bach faded, Elena took a breath before launching into Chopin's Ballade No. 1. Here was where she could really show her range. The piece began gently, almost questioning, before building to passionate intensity. Her hands moved across the keyboard with increasing urgency as the piece progressed, her body swaying slightly with the music's momentum. In his seat, Reed Thompson uncrossed his arms and leaned forward almost imperceptibly. The waitress, no, the pianist, was handling one of the most notoriously difficult pieces in the repertoire with surprising confidence. Her technique wasn't flawless. He noted a slight stumble in one particularly challenging run, but there was something in her interpretation that caught his attention, and emotional honesty that many technically perfect players never achieved. Elena was no longer thinking about technique or audience or criticism. She was telling a story through her fingers, pouring every frustration and triumph of the past years into the keys beneath her hands. When she reached the thunderous conclusion of the ballade, her heart was racing and a light sheen of perspiration had formed on her forehead. The applause that followed was enthusiastic, if not overwhelming. Most of the audience members weren't classical music aficionados, but they recognized skill and passion when they heard it. Elena acknowledged their response with a modest nod before adjusting her position on the bench. "The next piece I'll be playing is one of my own compositions," she announced, her voice soft but clear in the microphone positioned near the piano. "It's called Crossroads, and it explores the moments in life when we're forced to make choices that determine our path forward." This was the moment of truth. Playing established classical pieces was one thing, but sharing her own creation made her feel utterly exposed. She glanced up briefly before beginning and caught Reed Thompson's eye. His expression was unreadable, but he was watching her with undisguised interest. Elena's original composition began softly, with a recurring motif that suggested hesitation, uncertainty. As the piece progressed, it incorporated elements from both classical and jazz traditions, reflecting her diverse musical background. The harmonies were unconventional without being inaccessible, creating tensions that resolved in unexpected ways. In the audience, a silver-haired woman in the front row closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. 2 rows behind her, a music critic from the regional paper scribbled notes on a small pad. And halfway back, Reed Thompson sat completely still, his brow furrowed in concentration. As Crossroads built toward its climax, Elena felt a surge of confidence. This was her voice, her story. The piece wasn't perfect. She'd composed it during late nights between study sessions and work shifts, but it was authentically hers. The final section incorporated a subtle theme from the box she'd played earlier, now transformed into something entirely new, before concluding with a questioning chord that hung in the air like an unfinished thought. The silence that followed lasted only seconds but felt much longer to Elena. Then came the applause, warmer and more enthusiastic than before. The silver-haired woman in the front row was the first to her feet, followed by Darlene and Mick, and soon much of the audience had joined in a standing ovation. Elena's eyes widened slightly in surprise. She stood and bowed, a genuine smile spreading across her face. As she straightened, she couldn't help glancing at Reed's seat. He remained seated but was applauding with what appeared to be sincere appreciation, his earlier skepticism nowhere to be seen. For her final piece, Elena had chosen Liszt's La Campanella, a showstopper famous for its technical difficulty. After the warm reception of her original work, she returned to the piano with renewed confidence. Her fingers danced across the keys in the piece's characteristic leaps, the quick repeated notes ringing out like the little bells for which the piece was named. The audience watched in amazement as Elena's hands became almost a blur during the most demanding passages. Even those who knew nothing about classical piano could recognize the extraordinary skill required to play this piece. In the back of the auditorium, Lisa, the festival coordinator, was already mentally rearranging next year's schedule to include this remarkable young pianist in a prime slot. When Elena struck the final, triumphant chord of La Campanella, the response was immediate and enthusiastic. The entire audience rose to their feet, applauding and cheering. Elena stood and bowed deeply, overwhelmed by the response. She had performed well in student recitals before, but nothing had prepared her for this moment, for the feeling of connecting so profoundly with an audience of strangers. After a second bow, Elena made her way off stage, her legs suddenly shaky now that the adrenaline was beginning to ebb. In the wings, several stagehands offered congratulations as she passed. "That was quite something," said one older technician, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Been working this festival for 12 years and I don't remember an opening act getting that kind of reception." Elena thanked him, still somewhat dazed by the experience. She made her way to the small dressing room she'd been assigned, needing a moment to collect herself. She had just sat down when there was a knock at the door. "Come in," she called, expecting Lisa or perhaps Darlene and Mick. Instead, Reed Thompson entered, his tall frame filling the doorway. For a moment, neither spoke. "Your performance was unexpected," he said finally. Elena wasn't sure whether to be flattered or offended. "Thank you, I think." Reed stepped into the room, closing the door partly behind him. "No, I mean—" He paused, seemingly struggling with words for the first time since she'd met him. "I wasn't expecting that level of musicianship. Your original composition especially. It was compelling. Coming from Reed, whose recordings had won multiple awards and whose concerts sold out months in advance, this qualified as high praise." "Thank you," Elena said more sincerely. "That means a lot." Reed nodded, then hesitated before continuing. "About yesterday at the diner—" "It's fine," Elena interrupted, not wanting to revisit the humiliation. "No, it's not," Reed insisted. "I behaved poorly. I was stressed about changes to the program and took it out on you." "That's no excuse." Elena was surprised by his directness. Apology accepted. An awkward silence followed before Reed spoke again. "You mentioned you're working on your doctorate?" "Yes, at State University. Piano performance with a minor in composition." "Under Professor Chen?" Reed asked with interest. Elena nodded, impressed that he knew the department faculty. "He's my primary advisor." "He was my mentor years ago," Reed explained. "He's brilliant but doesn't suffer fools gladly." "That's putting it mildly," Elena agreed with a small laugh. Last month he told a first-year student that her Debussy sounded like a cat walking across a keyboard in a fog. Reed actually smiled at this, a genuine expression that transformed his usually serious face. That sounds like Chen. He once told me my interpretation of Beethoven's Pathétique was technically impressive and emotionally bankrupt. What did you do? Elena asked, curious despite herself. I spent 3 days locked in a practice room rethinking my entire approach to the piece, Reed admitted, and he was right. I was so focused on perfect execution that I'd lost sight of what the music was actually saying. This glimpse of humility from the renowned pianist surprised Elena. Perhaps there was more to Reed. Thompson than arrogance and Italian wool jackets. Their conversation was interrupted by another knock. Lisa poked her head in, her face flushed with excitement. Elena! That was extraordinary. The audience loved you. We've already had people asking if you have recordings available or if you're performing anywhere else soon. She handed Elena a business card. And Thomas Whitman from Meridian Records would like to speak with you when you have a moment. Elena stared at the card in disbelief. Meridian was a respected classical label. Thomas Whitman is here? Front row, silver hair, blue blazer, Lisa confirmed. He specifically requested an introduction. As Lisa's words sank in, Elena felt a mixture of excitement and terror. A record executive wanted to meet her. Her performance as a last-minute replacement might actually lead to something. Reed cleared his throat. I should let you prepare for your meeting, he said, moving toward the door. But perhaps we could continue our conversation later. I'm curious about your approach to composition. The way you integrated classical structures with modern harmonies was interesting. I'd like that, Elena replied, surprised at how much she meant it. After Reed left, Elena sat for a moment, trying to process everything that had happened. 24 hours ago, she had been just another waitress at Rosie's diner, balancing plates and dealing with difficult customers. Now she was backstage at the Pine Creek Music Festival, preparing to meet with a record executive, with Reed Thompson, the Reed Thompson expressing interest in her music. Life could change direction so quickly, she thought. Just like the crossroads in her composition. Taking a deep breath, Elena stood and smoothed her dress. Whatever opportunities lay ahead, she would face them with the same determination that had carried her through years of early morning practice sessions before breakfast shifts at the diner, through late nights studying after closing time, through moments of doubt when her dream seemed impossibly distant. She thought about the little upright piano waiting in her apartment, the one she'd saved for months to buy. We did it, she whispered to herself, a quiet acknowledgement of all the work, all the sacrifice that had led to this moment. Then, squaring her shoulders, Elena opened the door and stepped forward to meet whatever came next. The next morning, Elena woke to sunlight streaming through her apartment windows and the distant sound of traffic beginning to build on Main Street. For a moment she lay perfectly still, wondering if yesterday had been a dream. But the business cards on her nightstand, one from Thomas Whitman of Meridian Records and another from a music blogger who wanted to interview her, confirmed that it had all been wonderfully real. She reached for her phone and found it flooded with notifications. Congratulatory texts from classmates who'd attended the festival, a voice message from her piano professor who had heard about her performance from a colleague, and an email from Lisa asking if Elena would be interested in performing at next year's festival in a featured slot rather than as an opening act. Most surprising was a message from an unfamiliar number. This is Reed. Lisa gave me your contact information. I'm playing at Riverside Hall tonight at 8. There's a ticket for you at will call if you're interested. We could discuss music theory afterward. Your approach to harmonic structure is unconventional but intriguing. Elena read the message twice, a small smile playing at her lips. From stick to carrying plates you can handle to your approach to harmonic structure is intriguing in just 2 days. Quite a turnaround. As she made her morning coffee, Elena's phone rang. It was Darlene from the diner. You were incredible, honey, Darlene exclaimed without preamble. Mick and I had no idea you could play like that. Why on earth are you still serving pancakes at Rosie's? Elena laughed. Because pianists need to eat too, and concert opportunities don't exactly grow on trees. Well, after yesterday, I think that might change. Half the town is talking about your performance. Even my teenage nephew, who thinks classical music is boring old people stuff, I said you were, and I quote, actually kind of awesome. High praise indeed, Elena said, genuinely touched. Anyway, Darlene continued, I'm calling because Frank wants to know if you're coming in for your shift today. No pressure either way. He said he can call in Tanya if you've got more important things to do now that you're famous. Elena hesitated. Her meeting with Thomas Whitman had been promising but not conclusive. The record executive had been impressed with her performance and particularly interested in her original compositions. He'd asked to hear more of her work, and had mentioned the possibility of including her in a showcase of emerging classical artists that Meridian was planning for next spring. It was exciting but hardly a guarantee of future success. Tell Frank I'll be there, Elena decided. Dreams are wonderful, but bills are real. And I'm definitely not famous. After hanging up, Elena sipped her coffee and considered her unexpected invitation from Reed. Attending his concert would mean asking Frank to let her off early, which felt a bit hypocritical after just confirming she would work. But the opportunity to hear a pianist of Reed's caliber in an intimate venue like Riverside Hall, and to actually discuss music theory with him afterward, was too good to pass up. 2 hours later, Elena pushed through the swinging doors of Rosie's Diner, tying her apron as she went. The breakfast rush was just ending, and several customers did double takes as she moved between tables. Aren't you the pianist from yesterday? Asked an older man as she refilled his coffee cup. My wife made me go to the festival. I'm more of a country music fan myself, but I have to say you made those keys do things I didn't think were possible. Thank you, Elena replied with a smile. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Throughout her shift, similar interactions occurred. People who had previously looked past her as just another waitress now saw her differently. It was a strange feeling, both gratifying and slightly uncomfortable. During her break, Elena called Frank into the back office to ask about leaving early for Reed's concert. Of course you should go, Frank said immediately. The guy's supposed to be one of the best pianists in the country. Might learn something useful. Elena blinked in surprise. Frank was generally supportive but rarely enthusiastic about schedule changes. Are you sure? The dinner shift will be short-handed. Frank waved away her concern. After yesterday, I'm surprised you came in at all. Don't get me wrong. I appreciate the loyalty, but Elena, you've got real talent. Rosie's should be your backup plan, not your main gig. It's not that simple, Elena sighed. One good performance doesn't guarantee anything in the music world. Maybe not, Frank agreed. But you've got to be in position when opportunities come. Speaking of which, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small envelope. Hank dropped this off for you this morning. Inside the envelope was a parking pass for Riverside Hall and a note. For after the concert, Reed mentioned you two might be talking shop. I pulled some strings with the venue manager to get you access to the green room. Don't stay at Rosie's too late. Hank. Elena tucked the pass into her pocket, touched by Hank's ongoing support and slightly overwhelmed by how quickly things were moving. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of coffee refills, lunch orders, and conversations with curious customers. By 5 o'clock, Elena was rushing home to shower and change before Reed's concert. Standing before her closet, Elena faced a familiar dilemma. She owned exactly one formal dress, the simple black one she'd worn for her performance yesterday. It would have to do, though she added a colorful scarf for variety. As she was pinning up her hair, her phone buzzed with a text from her piano professor. Heard about your performance. Also heard Whitman was there. Call me tomorrow. We should discuss your final recital program in light of this development. Riverside Hall was an architectural gem on the edge of town, a small but acoustically perfect space that attracted notable musicians despite its modest size. Elena arrived 30 minutes before the concert was scheduled to begin and gave her name at the will call window. Ah, Ms. Rivera, said the attendant with a smile of recognition. Mr. Thompson left this for you. She handed Elena an envelope containing a ticket for a front row seat and a handwritten note. I thought you might appreciate a closer view of the keyboard. RT, the hall was nearly full when Elena took her seat. She recognized several faculty members from the university music department and a few serious music students she'd seen around campus. There was a buzz of anticipation in the air. Reed Thompson performances were known for their technical brilliance and emotional intensity. At precisely 8 o'clock, the house lights dimmed and Reed walked onto the stage to enthusiastic applause. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, his manner confident but not showy as he acknowledged the audience with a slight bow, before taking his seat at the magnificent grand piano. From the first notes of Beethoven's Appassionata Sonata, it was clear why Reed had earned his reputation. His playing was not merely technically flawless but emotionally revelatory, finding new depths in pieces that had been performed countless times by countless pianists. Elena watched his hands, mesmerized by their strength and precision, and felt both inspired and intimidated. This was artistry at the highest level. For his second piece, Reed surprised the audience by announcing an arrangement of a piece Elena recognized from her own repertoire, but with a twist. This next piece incorporates elements of a composition I heard yesterday at the festival, Reed explained, his voice carrying easily in the perfect acoustics. The original work is called Crossroads, composed by Elena Rivera, a remarkably talented pianist and composer whose work deserves wider recognition. A murmur rippled through the audience, and Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks as several heads turned in her direction. Reed's eyes found hers briefly before he returned his attention to the keyboard. What followed was a kind of musical conversation. Reed had taken the central theme from Elena's composition and developed it in his own distinctive style, honoring her original idea while expanding it in unexpected directions. It was both a tribute and a challenge, recognizing her work while demonstrating how it might evolve in the hands of a master. As the piece concluded, the audience burst into applause, with several people turning again to look at Elena. She sat perfectly still, overwhelmed by the gesture. For a renowned pianist like Reed Thompson to incorporate her work into his concert was an honor she could never have imagined. The remainder of the concert showcased Reed's incredible range, from the mathematical precision of Bach to the passionate romanticism of Rachmaninoff. When he returned for an encore, he chose a piece that Elena had played in her own performance, Chopin's Ballade No. 1. But his interpretation was entirely different from hers, more restrained and cerebral where hers had been emotionally direct. After the final standing ovation, Elena made her way backstage, showing her pass to the security guard who directed her to the green room. She found Reed surrounded by well-wishers, including several of her professors and what appeared to be some wealthy patrons of the arts. Reed spotted her at the edge of the group and excused himself, making his way to her side. "You came," he said, sounding genuinely pleased. "How could I not after that invitation?" Elena replied. "Your performance was, I don't even have words." "Coming from a musician of your caliber, that's high praise," Reed said, and there was no trace of the condescension that had marked their first meeting. "What did you think of my interpretation of your theme?" "It was like hearing someone take a conversation I started and expand it into a symphony," Elena admitted. "I'm still processing it, honestly." Reed smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face. "That's the highest compliment you could give. Music is a dialogue across time and space, isn't it? Between composers and performers, between performers and audiences, between different artistic traditions." As the crowd around them began to thin, Reed lowered his voice. "Would you be interested in continuing our own dialogue? I have some thoughts about your compositional approach that might be useful, and selfishly, I'd like to hear more about how you developed that jazz-influenced passage in Crossroads." Elena found herself nodding. "I'd like that. There's a quiet cafe around the corner that stays open late. The owner's a music lover who doesn't mind musicians talking shop until closing time." As they walked toward the stage door, Reed added, "By the way, I spoke with Thomas Whitman earlier. He mentioned you made quite an impression." Elena's pulse quickened. "He seemed interested, but I wasn't sure how serious he was. Thomas doesn't waste time on musicians unless he sees something special," Reed said matter-of-factly. "He asked my opinion about your work." "And what did you tell him?" Elena asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Reed stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "I told him that you have something rare, technical skill combined with an authentic musical voice. That's not something that can be taught." He paused before adding, "I also told him he'd be a fool not to sign you before someone else does." Elena stared at him, speechless. 2 days ago, this man had laughed at her for spilling water. Now he was advocating for her career to one of the most influential executives in classical music. "Why?" she finally managed to ask. Reed considered her question seriously. Because talent deserves recognition regardless of where it's found. Because music matters more than ego. He gave a self-deprecating smile. And because I was wrong about you and I hate being wrong. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Elena thought about the strange turns life could take. How a moment of humiliation could lead to an opportunity. How a chance encounter could change a trajectory. Perhaps that was what her composition Crossroads had been trying to express all along. So, Reed said as they walked side by side toward the cafe, tell me about how you developed your musical voice. I'm particularly interested in your integration of jazz harmonies into classical structures. As Elena began to explain her approach to composition, she realized with some surprise that they were now talking as equals, two musicians sharing ideas, challenges, and possibilities. Whatever happened next with Meridian Records or her career, this moment felt like a victory in itself. 6 months had passed since the Pine Creek Music Festival, and autumn had given way to winter, and then to the first tentative signs of spring. Elena stood at the window of her new apartment, watching raindrops trace patterns on the glass while cradling a mug of tea in her hands. The view wasn't spectacular, just the neighboring building and a slice of sky. But the apartment itself was a significant upgrade from her previous place, with enough room for her upright piano and a separate bedroom. On her kitchen counter sat an advance copy of her debut EP from Meridian Records, 5 tracks, including her original composition Crossroads and a collaborative piece she had created with Reed. The cover featured a striking black and white photograph of her hands on piano keys, elegant and purposeful. It would be released in 3 weeks, coinciding with a showcase concert at Carnegie Hall, where Elena would perform alongside 4 other emerging classical musicians Meridian had signed. Her phone buzzed with a text from her former piano professor. Just heard your interview on Classical Spotlight. Proud doesn't begin to cover it. Check your email. Sent you some thoughts on your Carnegie program. Elena smiled. Professor Chen remained as demanding as ever, even though she had officially completed her doctorate 2 months ago. His insistence on excellence had shaped her as a musician, and she valued his continued mentorship. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of change. After Reed's recommendation, Thomas Whitman had invited Elena to New York to record a demo at Meridian Studio. The resulting recordings had impressed the label executives enough to offer her a contract for an EP and potential full album. Elena had finished her doctoral requirements ahead of schedule, with her dissertation on the integration of jazz elements into classical composition earning highest honors. And then there was her evolving relationship with Reed Thompson. What had begun as mutual professional respect had gradually developed into something more complex. A friendship built on shared passion for music, challenging conversations about artistic interpretation, and occasionally heated debates about everything from Bach to contemporary composition techniques. Elena was pulled from her thoughts by another text notification. This one was from Reed. Just landed. Traffic is terrible. Might be 20 minutes late for rehearsal. Don't start without me. She texted back a quick acknowledgement and turned from the window. Their rehearsal wasn't scheduled for another 2 hours, but Reed's perfectionism meant he always arrived early to prepare. They were practicing for a special segment of her Carnegie Hall performance, a duet they had composed together that would conclude her portion of the showcase. As Elena moved to her piano to warm up, her gaze fell on a framed photograph on the wall. The staff of Rosie's Diner gathered around her after her final shift 3 months ago. She had continued working part-time even after signing with Meridian, reluctant to abandon the job that had supported her through years of study. It was only when her performance and recording commitments made it impossible to maintain regular hours that she had finally hung up her apron. Frank had organized a surprise goodbye party, complete with a cake decorated with a miniature piano. Darlene had cried a little, though she tried to hide it. Mick had gruffly presented her with a gift from the kitchen staff, a beautiful leather portfolio for her sheet music, embossed with her initials. And Hank, who had first suggested her for the festival, had simply raised a toast to Elena, who reminds us all that greatness can be found in unexpected places. Elena ran her fingers over the keys of her piano, beginning her warm-up routine. The familiar exercises grounded her amid the changes in her life. Whatever success came her way, the fundamentals remained the same. The discipline of daily practice, the challenge of expressing emotion through technique, the endless pursuit of musical truth. She was halfway through a Chopin etude when her doorbell rang. Surprised, Reed wouldn't arrive for at least another hour. Even with his tendency to be early, Elena went to answer it. Standing in the hallway was Thomas Whitman, elegantly dressed as always and holding what appeared to be newspaper clippings. "Thomas, I wasn't expecting you," Elena said, genuinely surprised. The record executive rarely made personal visits to artists' homes. "I was in the neighborhood for another meeting and thought I'd drop these off in person," he explained, handing her the clippings. "Advance reviews of your EP. I thought you might like to see them." Elena invited him in and quickly scanned the first review from a respected classical music journal. Rivera brings fresh perspective to traditional forms, with technical prowess that serves emotional depth rather than mere display. Her original compositions reveal a distinctive voice that honors classical traditions, while fearlessly incorporating contemporary influences. The second, from a mainstream music publication, was equally positive. In a genre often criticized for stagnation, Rivera emerges as a breath of fresh air. Her interpretation of Bach demonstrates reverence without rigidity, while her original work suggests exciting new possibilities for classical composition in the 21st century. These are... "Wow," Elena managed, genuinely moved by the recognition. Thomas smiled, clearly pleased with her reaction. "The advanced streaming numbers are strong too, especially for a classical debut. You're reaching beyond the traditional audience, which is exactly what we hoped for." After Thomas left, Elena sat at her kitchen table, reviews spread before her, trying to process this latest development. 6 months ago, she had been serving coffee and dealing with difficult customers while squeezing in practice time whenever possible. Now critics were praising her musical voice, and she was preparing for her Carnegie Hall debut. The doorbell rang again, and this time it was Reed, arriving even earlier than he had suggested in his text. "I thought you were stuck in traffic," Elena said as she let him in. "Driver found a shortcut," Reed explained, unwinding his scarf. His gaze fell on the newspaper clippings on the table. "Are those the reviews?" Elena nodded. "Thomas just dropped them off." Reed picked up one of the clippings and read it, a smile slowly spreading across his face. "They get it," he said simply. "They actually understand what makes your work special." "It's still hard to believe any of this is happening," Elena admitted. Reed set down the review and looked at her thoughtfully. "Is it? From where I stand, it seems like the natural progression of talent meeting opportunity," says the child prodigy who was playing concertos with major orchestras at age 12, Elena teased. Reed acknowledged this with a small shrug. "Different paths, same destination. Speaking of which," he pulled a folder from his bag. "I had some thoughts about the middle section of our duet. The transition feels abrupt. What if we developed this motif more fully before the key change?" And just like that, they were back in their element, hunched over the piano, debating musical choices and trying different approaches. Their working relationship had fallen into a comfortable pattern. Reed's precision and structural sensibility, balanced by Elena's emotional intuition and harmonic innovation. They challenged each other, sometimes sparking creative tensions, but the results were invariably stronger for it. 3 hours later, exhausted but satisfied with their progress, they ordered takeout from Elena's favorite Thai restaurant and ate at her small dining table. "I had a call from Eastman School of Music yesterday," Reed mentioned between bites of pad Thai. "They're interested in having me teach a masterclass series next fall." "You should do it," Elena said immediately. "You'd be an excellent teacher." Reed looked skeptical. "I'm not known for my patience." "No, but you are known for your honesty and your commitment to the music. Students need that more than false encouragement." Reed considered this, then changed the subject. "Have you thought about my suggestion? About the European tour?" The question hung in the air between them. Last month, Reed had proposed that Elena join him for several dates on his upcoming European tour, not as an opening act, but as a featured collaborator, performing both solo works and their duet compositions. "It's a generous offer," Elena said carefully. "It's not charity," Reed replied, a hint of his old sharpness returning. "It makes musical sense. European audiences are more receptive to new classical compositions. Your work would resonate there. And the fact that your name on the program would guarantee sold-out venues has nothing to do with it?" Elena challenged. Reed set down his fork. 6 months ago, I would have been offended by that suggestion. Now I recognize it as good business sense. Yes, my name sells tickets. That's the reality of the classical music world. But once they're in the seats, your playing will speak for itself. He paused before adding, "It did with me." Elena couldn't argue with that. "I'll think about it," she promised. After dinner, they returned to the piano to refine a particularly challenging passage of their duet. As they played together, Elena was struck by how far they had come from that first uncomfortable encounter at Rosie's diner. The arrogant man who had dismissed her was now her most vocal champion in the music world. The waitress he had laughed at was now his creative collaborator. The following week found Elena in a rehearsal hall at Carnegie, practicing for her showcase performance. The magnificence of the space, knowing how many legendary musicians had performed there, initially left her feeling small and unprepared. But as she settled into her practice, the familiar communion with the music gradually overcame her insecurity. She was so absorbed in a difficult passage that she didn't notice someone entering the hall until they spoke. "Your phrasing in the development section is exquisite, but you're rushing the recapitulation slightly." Elena looked up to see Reed standing at the edge of the stage, his expression serious but his eyes warm. "How long have you been listening?" she asked. "Long enough to know you're ready," he replied, coming to join her at the piano. "But you don't believe it yet," Elena sighed. "It's Carnegie Hall, Reed. Every great pianist in history has played here. And tomorrow night, they'll add Elena Rivera to that list," he said matter-of-factly. His confidence in her was both comforting and slightly terrifying. "What if I freeze? What if I forget the middle section of Crossroads? What if you give the performance of your life and launch a remarkable career?" Reed interrupted. "What if this is just the beginning of your musical journey?" Elena smiled despite her nerves. "When did you become an optimist?" "I'm not," Reed said seriously. "I'm a realist who recognizes exceptional talent when I hear it, even if it sometimes takes me a while." On the night of the showcase, Elena stood in the wings, watching the audience file in. The hall was nearly full, an impressive turnout for a showcase of emerging artists. In the front row, she could see Thomas Whitman with several Meridian executives. A few rows back sat Professor Chen, looking characteristically stern, and scattered throughout the audience were familiar faces from her former life. Frank and his wife, Darlene and Mick, even a few regular customers from Rosie's who had made the trip to New York specially. "Nervous?" Reed asked, appearing at her side in his concert attire. He would join her for the duet that would conclude her performance. "Terrified," Elena admitted. Reed nodded, understanding completely. "Use it. Channel it into the music." When her name was announced, Elena walked onto the stage, the spotlight momentarily blinding her. The applause was polite but reserved. This audience didn't know her yet. She took her seat at the magnificent Steinway, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. For a suspended moment, she thought of everything that had led her here. Years of practice before dawn and after midnight, the encouragement of teachers who recognized her potential, the support of friends who believed in her, even the dismissive laugh of a renowned pianist that had ultimately opened an unexpected door. Then Elena began to play, and everything else fell away. Her program moved from Bach to Chopin to her own compositions, each piece flowing into the next with a natural momentum. She played with technical precision, yes, but also with the emotional honesty that had first caught Reed's attention, the quality that couldn't be taught, only cultivated. The audience response grew warmer with each piece. By the time she reached Crossroads, the hall was utterly silent. Hundreds of people listening intently as Elena shared her musical story of choices and consequences, opportunities seized and paths not taken. For her final piece, Reed joined her on stage, taking his place at a second piano positioned